Okay, welcome to video number 2. I promise things will get more simple. Unlike most videos, things get more complicated the further you go on this video. On this video series, things will get a lot more simple as things go on. This is a discussion of why FX sensors are both good and bad, and why DX sensors are both good and bad. Let's take a look at this satellite dish array. Here we have a large dish in the back. Here we have a lot of smaller dishes right here. Ultimately, a dozen of the larger dishes are achieving, for a lot more money, what the smaller dishes are achieving in greater numbers in a much smaller ultimate area. Okay? You understand? Very simple. Talking about noise gain, reduction, dynamic range, tonal range. What does the FX have that the DX doesn't? What does the DX have that the FX doesn't? Let's take a look at the analogy, make it really simple. I know a lot of you people out there aren't ham radio operators. You don't think in terms of signal to noise ratio, but a radio signal from space, as far as like your direct TV that's feeding your TV, is no different than light that's being captured by your lens and by your sensor ultimately. Okay, no difference. What are we going to crop in over here on a DX sensor with high pixel density? What's going to happen here? What's going to happen here if we got to crop in here? I lose a lot of my advantages if I crop into the same point on the FX sensor as I do on the DX sensor. What's the difference? What's the advantages between the two? As we just said, larger photo sites, just like Yagi antennas or satellite antennas. Most people know satellite dishes. Most of you are not ham radio operators, obviously. You don't understand what a Yagi antenna does or is. Just think of it as like a satellite dish. A large number of satellite dishes versus a large number of tiny rubber ducky antennas. Rubber ducky antennas, okay, do not have high gain, nor do they have high directionality for reception. It's the same thing as this photo site on the DX and the FX sensor. And this has a negative side. Like I said, on the large field of the satellite dishes, a large size versus a small field with the tiny dishes. Enlarging in on that DX field yields more resolving information, whereas the larger dishes have better tonal gain and dynamic range and better low signal. Okay? Each pixel is just like a faster lens. It's allowing for more light strikes, but the capacitance of what you're thinking of, there's actually the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. But if we're going to crop in on this versus to crop in on this, what's the difference? Let's just make things really simple. Okay, I know you're thinking, well, you complicated things and I don't understand. Well, let's just really reduce it down to really simple stuff. Why are FX sensors better and why are they not better? An FX sensor has larger photosites, but that doesn't mean it gathers more light, but it has a higher likelihood of a strike over UT, a unit of time. Okay, pretty simple, right? You got like a dozen rubber duckies down here in the field versus a huge satellite dish. Dynamic range describes the fullness of tones which a sensor can capture below that level which a pixel becomes completely white, yet above that level where texture is indiscernible from background noise, i.e. black or near black. Pixel density, at least for now, is lower on full-frame sensors, which means that each pixel is both larger and more spaced out from the next pixel or photosite, which allows for more light per unit of time, UT. A bigger bullseye for a bigger strike surface. How DX sensors compensate for this now, like on the D7200 and the new D750, is algorithms and time compression firmware, which reduces out a lot of that noise. Like a lot of these rubber duckies versus, if you're tuning in on one frequency, say 400 megahertz here and 400 megahertz over here, obviously you have awesome signal to noise ratio over here. Over here it's bad, but that's unit per time because the ultimate area is a lot smaller. But that can be eliminated by compression technologies and firmware, which eliminates out the time variable, which actually causes bad signal to noise ratio. This is some of the hidden BS that actually Nikon and Canon keep secret. Their firmware and their signal processing AD converters, which actually can take a trillion rubber duckies on a DX sensor, and what it does is it tricks it so that the ultimate image quality is awesome by eliminating out that time variable of noise, both with firmware and through their AD converters and also the software. Ultimately, this doesn't mean full-frame sensors are better, period, but rather they have a better latitude in high contrast, low light situations in a special tonal gradation of the image shot. A downside is if you end up cropping the FX image obviously to the size of the DX image, you really have done is that you have far less of any advantage and also have a lot lower pixel density for enlargement latitude. An FX sensor has better dynamic range and high ISO signal-to-noise ratio performance in general. A lot of that has been narrowed recently. It's been narrowed drastically, actually, in the past few years. DX cameras will spank the living dog piss out of a full-frame sensor due to high pixel density, which is why nature shooters, who almost always crop the living hell out of their images, prefer DX sensors due to per millimeter resolving power. However, this is about to change the next years, where FX full-frame sensors are going to have all the advantages of DX sensors. You're going to have full-frame sensors with DX pixel density. Full-frame sensors have a huge arsenal of lenses to take advantage of. Another huge advantage of full-frame, especially wide angles, and of course take advantage of the field of view. In this case, FX sensor, full-frame sensor cameras, spank the living hell out of DX sensors. Now hold on, we're going to get to the DX advantages here in a second. Like a 200mm lens, for example, on a camera with a crop factor of 1.5 has the same angle of view as a 300mm lens on a full-frame camera. The extra reach for a given number of pixels is also much higher on a DX sensor, which is extremely helpful in wildlife or sports, obviously and logically so. FX advantage, like if one uses a 50mm f1.4 lens on a full-frame sensor, this would produce a depth of field so shallow that it would require an aperture of 0.9, actually it's 0.8 something, on a camera with a DX sensor. But, that's not a consideration for most things other than portraiture and high depth of field control. But of course a 0.9 aperture on a DX sensor, DX lens for a DX sensor is not even possible. So if you want to use a 50mm and have a depth of field of f1.4 equivalent on the DX, the aperture required for that out of the DX sensor is not possible. It doesn't exist, 0.9 or 0.88 aperture. Smaller DX sensor doesn't equal inferior. D7100, D750 are the same megapixel count. But megapixel count is only a portion of the story of final image quality and resolution. Ultimately, photo site gain, and signal to noise ratio is insanely important. Resolving power, dynamic range, tonal latitude. Here's a huge advantage of DX sensors. DX sensors using some crappy FX lenses with optical impurities, especially vignetting, mean that they cut the nasty fat off a crappy FX lens and only use a sweet spot at the center. Which also means that these crappy FX lenses that pros know are crappy, they sell them for cheap, but it's like, hey, it's crappy on an FX camera, but hey, guess what? You're only using the sweet spot of the lens on a DX camera. This means that the crop sensor equivalently effectively discards the lowest quality portions of the image, which is quite useful when using low quality lenses. These typical lenses have a really bad edge quality. Remember, every lens, FX or DX, doesn't matter how expensive, what it is, projects a circle of light. It's like, oh, this is a crappy lens, it's got chromatic aberration, it's blurry. When I use this on my FX camera, I got this pile of crap here. It's like, well, that's fine. You know what? Because when I use this lens on my DX sensor, everything is awesome. Huge advantage for DX cameras. This is also why the FX fisheye lens makes one hell of a damn sharp lens on a DX camera. However, this also means that DX cameras using excellent FX expensive lenses are tossing away a lot of the circle of light projection, which makes up 60% or more of the cost of the big fat lens. Let's take the best lens that many can buy. This certainly not. Except for Nikon, let's say it's 14 to 24. You're going to throw that $2,000 lens on your DX camera. It's like, okay, there's a $2,000 lens. Guess what? Over here is about $1,200 of the lens that you're not using on your DX camera. So when we want to talk about the one aspect where you can say it's true that an FX lens is overkill on a DX camera, this is the one time. Using an awesome FX lens on a DX sensor. You know, you're paying for all this out here that's being wasted. You know, it's like buying filet mignon for your dog. It's like, well, that's great, but you're wasting it on something that can't appreciate it. If, however, well, as I gave you the prior example, you use a crappy FX lens on a DX sensor, you've eliminated all that vignetting and crud that's on the edge, and you've got an excellent lens on your DX camera. You know, even if two sensors have the same noise when viewed at 100%, the sensor with the higher pixel count, i.e. DX, will produce a cleaner looking final print, obviously and logically so. This is because the noise gets enlarged less for the higher pixel count sensor for a given print size. Obviously, what's going to happen if you take the FX image and you crop into the DX crop factor between the two? What do we have there? What's that? Why are nature shooters with, where money is no object, using DX pixel density cameras? Okay, it's not, megapixels is only one tiny aspect of your camera. What's the megapixel count? What's the megapixel count? What's the megapixel? God, shut up. What about the lens? What about pixel density? What about resolving power? What about signal to noise ratio? The optical performance of wide-angle lenses is rarely as good as longer focal length, since the DX sensor is forced to use a wider angle lens, like a 10.5mm fisheye lens for a DX versus a 16mm fisheye lens, full-frame fisheye lens, produces the same angle of view as a larger sensor. This can degrade quality. FX advantages: high sensitivity. Each physical pixel on an FX sensor is much larger than that on an equivalent megapixel DX sensor. The FX version has more area for which to capture light over UT, unit of time. This translates into a higher sensitivity, or to put it in another way, lower SNR, lower noise. This means it outputs amazing high ISO images far beyond those of DX, but a lot of that has been reduced in the past year and a half. Lower than that of DX or 35mm full-frame chips. Additionally, the larger light gathering capability of a full-frame or FX pixel also helps to improve the dynamic range and allow for finer tonal gradations. The other advantage of an FX camera, obviously you have more honking light being reflected by a larger FX mirror. Let's just forget about the sensor. Now for a second, let's just look at the mirror on an FX versus DX. You got eyesight issues. Here we got a DX mirror. Here we have an FX mirror. You have a brighter viewfinder. FX sensor has a larger viewfinder. Term means you have larger viewfinder prism used, and it's a result that you're looking through the eyepiece in a large, bright, and detailed image. Which might be a shocker for some people that you've been used to DX tunnel vision by looking at lower light due to a smaller mirror. Obviously, there isn't an FX mirror in a DX camera. There's a DX size mirror in a DX DSLR camera. FX disadvantages: image uniformity. The FX sensor really doesn't stress the lens being used. If you're using an FX lens on a DX body, you're just using the sweet spot in the center of the lens. On an FX, you're also using the edges of the lens, which are never as sharp as the center. We're going to go up and finish up on video number 3, and thank you very much.